My name is Didi Kuo. I am the Associate Director for Research at Stanford's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, which sits underneath the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. You might know there's a global crisis of democracy, but today we're just going to bring it home and talk about the United States. So if you, like me, live in a coastal city and walk into a bookstore on a regular basis, you will see a table in the front that's like the big warning sign table with titles about fascism and authoritarianism and oligarchy and far-right extremism and how democracies die. This is turning into a cottage industry of books because we live in a time of potential despair about the quality of democracy worldwide. Why is it that we have a crisis of democracy? Well, let's think about indicators. How do we know that we're living in a crisis? The first is that levels of trust in government have declined precipitously over the past 60 or 70 years. This is just Gallup calling people up on the phone. Do you trust the federal government to do what is right? We now see that most people say no. And if you disaggregate this and look at specific institutions like Congress or the presidency, those numbers get down to the single digits. I heard in the previous session you asking about why climate policy is not happening. Not much policy at all is happening. Congress is pretty ineffective, and that registers with the American public. We also know that we live in a time of political polarization. We know in the newspaper, for example, that Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell are always duking it out with Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. So we know that our elites are polarized. But that has filtered down into the American public. You probably remember all of those news articles like how to have a dinner table conversation at Thanksgiving with those relatives who think differently than you. That's because we increasingly don't get along with each other if we're from different parties. In 1994, the average Democrat and Republican were not super different when you ask them about their policy preferences or their values. In 2004, still not that different. In 2017, there's very little overlap between Democrats and Republicans, and those numbers have just widened over time. We also know that this is an era of rising economic inequality. So this chart on the left is data from the Brookings Institution from an economist called Raj Chetty, showing that even in the post-war period, which we think of as a period of sort of equality and growth, the proportion of kids who did better than their parents economically was actually going down. And on the right is a chart of the Gini index, which is just a ratio of top income earners, or the sort of top of the income distribution to the bottom. That has also gone up over more recently, the past 50 years. The United States is now the most unequal country among the advanced liberal democracies, the countries of the OECD. So if you think that democracy is at risk, you are right there with 70% of the American public. This poll was from January 2022. And democracy watchdogs, which are organizations that try to measure the quality of democracy around the world, are also tending to agree. Usually American democracy is like a Stanford undergrad, a straight A student. Okay? These are usually scores that are like 100 out of 100 that we rank on democracy. But recently, an organization called Freedom House downgraded our democracy score to an 83 out of 100. The Economist Intelligence Unit, which is a think tank affiliated with the magazine, downgraded us to a flawed democracy. And they cited the things that I just mentioned: trust, polarization, economic inequality, also things like racism and bias in criminal justice. So the Transparency International one is interesting. This usually measures corruption in emerging market economies, but they found that levels of corruption in the United States have also risen in the past 5 years or so. This meme is often used when I go to academic conferences about American democracy we know the house is on fire, but we still don't really know how to make sense of it. And after 2020, we had a president who denied the results of the election, said that it was fraudulent. We know that at the state level, battles over voting rights, which are like 50 or 60 years old, are now back on the table. 25 states have made it easier to vote because of COVID protocols in 2020. They became more like California. You can mail in your ballot. It's really easy to access voting. But 22 states have made it harder to vote by rolling back things that they did during COVID. And in fact, 11 to 14 states have passed legislation giving the state legislature partisan oversight over election administration, allowing them to count the ballots, to revisit how election administration is performed by the Secretary of State. So why is democracy in decline? There are a lot of different reasons. All of those books from the first slide all give you a different reason. There's sort of an economics bucket. We've moved away from a manufacturing economy. We live in this globalized, financialized world in which the knowledge economy produces a small set of winners in sectors like finance and tech, while the average American worker gets a worser deal. There's fewer economic opportunities. We also know there's maybe like a cultural change bucket, that there is more immigration, that there's social and technological change, social media, disinformation, and this maybe makes people more anxious, more worried, feel a threat to their status, that kind of thing. And finally, there's just all the regular problems with politics. Campaign finance, for example, has become much more deregulated and decentralized. So this gives people much more influence, people with money or corporations, more influence in the political process. We also know there's partisan gerrymandering after the 2020 census. We know right now that there are tons of things being litigated, maps of how political parties try to maintain their power within the states. So if we're trying to think of how to put these all together and make sense of them, I'm going to focus today on something else, a crisis of representation. I guess the argument here is sort of, the call is coming from inside the house. It's not these outside problems that are causing our crisis, but instead, we have just a crisis of representation. Usually the way democracy works is through political parties. And usually when political parties work effectively, they help democracy work and they give it meaning. There's a famous political scientist called E.E. Schatzsnyder who said, modern democracy is unthinkable, save in terms of parties. The dawn of democracy coincided with the rise of parties to help create a class interest and different kinds of values interests into politics. But when parties can't be effective intermediaries, when they don't adequately represent the interests of people and tie them to what the government actually does in response, they become weaker, and that degrades the quality of democracy. Now, it may be ridiculous to say that parties are weak. I just spent this time telling you that we're really polarized, for example. And a lot of the political reformers these days, in pursuing different ways that we might change our election system or our political system, want to get rid of parties entirely. They think that parties are a hegemonic malefactor in democracy. But one thing that obscures is that more and more people are already sort of taking themselves away from parties. In Europe, where you have card-carrying party membership, i.e. you pay a fee and you get to be a member of a party, party membership has been in steady decline for the past 30 or 40 years. And in the United States, even though there are high levels of polarization, more and more people, now a plurality of the American electorate, actually identifies as independent. Sure, they might still cast a ballot for Democrats or Republicans on election day, but a lot of survey evidence indicates they are more cynical about politics overall and more disengaged from democracy. So a rising number of independents who are not part of the party system actually increase distrust in democracy over time and tend to really believe the populist messaging, you know, that there's like a special elite, a cabal of political and economic people in DC who are just working against our common interests. So if we go back in time for a very quick history lesson, parties developed as democracy was expanding in the 19th century. Representative democracy, of course, we think of the United States as the oldest one, but in most of the world, you had monarchic societies, you know, governed by a king, who was only accountable to a tiny coterie of people, like a little legislature of nobility who would say to him, you know, you're taxing us too much to go fight that foreign war, maybe lower the taxes, that kind of thing. As the suffrage expanded to non-property owners and power was therefore distributed more equally, those legislative factions had to find a way to mobilize people at the local level. They had to match their interests, which helped them become factions in the first place, to the interests of people in society. And one way they did that was by trying to take careful stock of what it is people needed from government and providing that in the form of policy. So sometimes parties, like conservative parties, represented traditional interests, like the landed aristocracy or the clergy and nobility. You know, think of the people in Downton Abbey, for example. But also, parties developed to represent new interests, especially, say, workers' parties, labor parties, that were often fighting not just for economic rights, but for political rights. We also know there were agrarian farmers, for example, in the United States, who were part of democracy during the Industrial Revolution, when they felt like the railways, which did build this university, so there's some credit there, but when they felt like these new monopolistic industries during the Gilded Age were infringing on them, they also became more politically active and found representation in the parties. So the story of party development is a highly local one. It wasn't just parties with headquarters in Washington, D.C., who occasionally came out into local areas and asked you to vote for this or that candidate. Instead, parties had a local presence. They helped to mobilize and socialize people into politics, to register them to vote. They often provided materials, like educational materials on different kinds of issues. And over the course of the 20th century, as you developed a more industrial economy, they created ties to associational groups, civic groups like churches or fraternal organizations or labor unions to help create a whole culture around party membership. There are some stories, of course, from party machines, urban machines, like you would get a wedding present from your local party boss. Or there are cradle-to-the-grave parties, like social democratic parties in Europe, that would give you support when you had a baby, provide college scholarships and vocational training, all the way into old age, provide you with help there. But party organizations have changed. What I've described is nothing like what we see today. Parties are no longer membership organizations. Instead, they're more like affinity groups. We think of parties as we would think of team sports. And there's a lot of evidence that people who get involved in politics are doing it because they have the time and the resources, and they like it, not necessarily because they have a stake in it or because they feel like the party is responsive to them. We know that parties focus exclusively on fundraising, advertising, and campaigns. They've developed an entire industry of messaging and PR to try to market very tiny messages to specific slivers of people, what you've probably heard of as micro-targeting, for example. All of that does help parties craft a message, but it's a one-way relationship where parties have already decided what the policy agenda is going to be and sell it to segments of the population. I can guarantee that in the run-up to the 2022 elections, probably many of you are going to get lots of emails all the time that, it's urgent, donate now. That is a relationship that we have with parties today as sort of emails, lists of emails for the parties. Finally, we know from a wealth of evidence across the social sciences that parties are really good at representing corporate and affluent interests, concentrated interests, more so than working class interests. If you look at maps, or not real maps, but just like tables of where majorities of Americans are on a lot of policy issues, they really diverge from what parties do. But that's not the case when you map it against what corporate and affluent interests want. So the final thing I'll say just has to do with a shift in education. Education has become the biggest cleavage in many of these post-industrial societies. Parties of the left used to be parties of the working class, but class has become an increasingly muddled way to think about politics. And parties of the left increasingly represent really highly educated people who are beneficiaries of the knowledge economy, while parties of the right increasingly mobilize those left behind, relying often, in this weird kind of paradox, because they have a sort of fiscally conservative set of policies, they rely often on cultural or racial messaging, symbolic messaging, in order to appeal to those voters. So the big question is, do parties do a good job representing interests today? I don't think they really do, and that has consequences for democracy when parties consistently represent some groups well while neglecting other ones. When all of the parties in a democracy tend to compete for the same set of votes from people, it can leave the rest of the electorate feeling abandoned. And distrust in parties can sow further distrust in democracy, which exacerbates all of the problems from before of changing economy, changing technology, et cetera. But the hopeful note of optimism is that while parties may be part of the problem, they're also part of the solution. Parties can create new ways of interconnecting with voters and civic associations that have been super active, especially since 2016 and 2020, mobilizing around those elections. And if parties can be more responsive to voters, then they can begin to do the work of restoring faith in democracy and democratic institutions. Stronger parties are good for democracy. Thank you for your time.